2,000 years ago, John writes one of his 7 letters to the churches. And in this particular letter, he writes to a small, obscure church called Thyatira. And the focus of this letter is that John wants God's people to be careful to not be pulled away by idolatry and immorality. Think about it. Not much has changed in 2,000 years. Idolatry, this idea that I put something or someone ahead of God, that something or someone becomes more important than my relationship with God, that will pull us away from him. But also, so will sexual immorality. And so Jesus is going to be very specific with this church. So here's the great challenge. The early followers of Jesus were faced with a difficult dilemma. You see, back then, Thyatira would be considered what we would say today a blue-collar town, a union card-carrying town, because they had all of these trade guilds. There was all kinds of things being made in this small city. There was the wood trade faction, there was leather, there was wool, there was pottery. And so most of the people there that made a living were in one of these trade guilds. Now here's the problem. If you were in a trade guild, every trade guild had its own special patron idol. And when you go to a meeting, what you would do is you would worship that idol. You would eat meat that had been sacrificed to that idol. And then as the meeting was going along, people would get drunk, they would get wild, and all kinds of sexual immorality would take place. And so that was the great dilemma for those early followers of Jesus. Like on one hand, I'm a Christian, but this guy's asking me to worship an idol. On the other hand, God is holy, and yet they're asking me to get involved in all of this sexual morality. And if I don't do it, I'll lose my job and my kids could starve. I mean, this is really difficult. And so Jesus wants them to know something. And Jesus begins this letter in a very positive and affirming way. Listen to what he says. Revelations 2:19. I know all the things you do. I have seen your love, your faith, your service, and your patient endurance. And I can see your constant improvement in all these things. You see, Jesus is actually really impressed with some of the things they're doing. They have faith, they have love, they're learning endurance, they're learning how to suffer for the gospel. And so he begins in a very positive fashion. But very quickly, his affirmation turns to accusation. And he has some complaints against them. And here's the main complaint. That when there is idolatry and there's immorality, people get pulled away from God. And so listen to what Jesus has to say to them. But I have this complaint against you. You are permitting that woman, that Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, to lead my servants astray. She teaches them to commit sexual sin and to eat food offered to idols. You see, in the Old Testament, Jezebel was the most wicked, ungodly person in the entire Bible. She called herself a prophetess. She said she spoke for God, and yet she led people into idol worship and to gross sexual immorality. And so apparently this young church, this small young church, has another Jezebel-type woman, and she's doing the same thing. She's saying, oh, you can have God and idols at the same time. You can be holy and yet commit unholy acts at the same time. And so Jesus says, hey, you got to be careful about that, because all of that's going to pull you away from God. Now think about this. You know what we say about Sin City, Las Vegas, right? Everybody knows this phrase, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, that's not actually what happens. You see, whatever happens in Vegas actually never stays in Vegas. And 2,000 years ago, they would have said it this way. Whatever happens in the trade guild meetings always stays in the trade guild meetings. But we know that's not true, because Jesus lets them know. He says, listen, I have eyes that can see. You know, I have x-ray vision. I have night vision goggles. I can see what you're doing behind those closed doors. I can see what you're doing when the lights go off. And I don't want my people involved in worship of idols. I don't want my people in gross sexual immorality. And so Jesus says, listen, whatever happens in Vegas never stays in Vegas. And so this is his loving warning to his people. You see, Jesus is so concerned about that. He's so concerned about the reality that people are being sucked away from God, that he gives them help. He gives them an answer. He gives them an antidote. He gives them a remedy. And the remedy, the antidote, is if you do not want to get corrupted by the corrupt culture in which you live, you got to hang and hold on to Jesus for dear life. Jesus talks about literally hanging on to him and his teaching if you want to survive a corrupt culture. Watch what he says. But I also have a message for the rest of you in Thyatira who have not followed this false teaching. I will ask nothing more of you except that you hold tightly to what you have until I come. You see, Jesus says, I'm the remedy. I'm the antidote. If you really want to endure and have a positive influence for Christ in this corrupt culture, you've got to hold on to me, and you've got to hold on to my teaching. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do I do that? Well, here's how you do that. You got to spend time with Christ. You got to spend time with him in prayer. You got to spend time reading his word. You need to be in a mentoring relationship. You need to be discipled by someone. You need to be discipled in the context of a small group. Parents, you've got to mentor your own kids spiritually, because that's the only way that we're going to survive this corrupt culture in which we live. So here's what I so appreciate about Jesus. He knows it's hard. He knows they and us are living in a culture full of idols and sexual immorality. And he says, okay, I don't want to leave you in that, but I am the answer. Spend time with me, hang out with me, and I'm the remedy for living in these difficult days.